going too fast. I can't, there's no response from the reverse thrust.
Sao Paulo, July 17, 2007. The wheels of Tam Airlines flight 3054 touched down on runway 35 Elliott at Congonhas Airport. On paper, this is the easy part. A routine domestic flight, 1 hour and 30 minutes from Porto Alegre. But something is wrong. The plane is not slowing down. Two of the most experienced pilots in Brazil are fighting their controls. One engine is pulling the plane backward. The other is pushing it forward at full power. The runway is slick with rain and it is running out fast. In 26 seconds, this Airbus A320 carrying 187 people will deviate from the runway, fly over a highway full of rush hour traffic, and slam into a building at full speed. This is the story of South America's deadliest aviation disaster. It is July 2007. Brazil is in the middle of a full-blown aviation crisis. Air travel in Brazil had been growing at 15% every single year. Airlines were expanding fast, airports were overflowing, and air traffic controllers were stretched so thin the system was cracking. Just 10 months before this crash, a Boeing 737 and a private jet collided in mid-air over the Amazon, killing 154 people. At the center of this train system was one airport, Congonhas. Congonhas Airport sits right in the heart of Sao Paulo. The city has grown so tightly around the airport that there is literally nowhere for it to expand. Runway 35 Elliott at Congonhas is just 1,940 meters long. For context, most major international airports have runways closer to 3,000 meters. In early 2007, the runway at Congonhas was resurfaced. New tarmac was laid down. And when a runway is resurfaced, one of the most important steps is cutting grooves into the surface. Imagine what happens when it rains heavily on a smooth, flat surface. Water doesn't drain away. It sits there in a thin sheet. And when an aircraft's tires hit that thin sheet of water at high speed, something called hydroplaning can occur. Grooves are cut into runways specifically to solve this problem. They let the tires grip the surface even in heavy rain. The resurfacing at Congonhas was completed on June 29, 2007. But the grooves, the most critical safety feature, were not added. The airport authorities said adding grooves would require an additional 30 days. And so rather than wait, they simply reopened the runway without them. Pilots immediately noticed in the weeks after the reopening, multiple aircraft reported poor braking conditions on 35 liters. The airport had a policy of closing the runway whenever this happened and inspecting it before reopening. Then came July 16th. The day before the crash, an ATR-42 turboprop came in to land on runway 35 liters. The aircraft hydroplaned. It veered off the runway, struck a utility box and a light pole, and came to rest in the grass. No one was killed, but the warning could not have been clearer. The plane for Flight 3054 was an Airbus A320. It had been in service since 1998 and had accumulated over 21,000 flight hours. It was a reliable aircraft, and TAM had been operating it since January of that year. But this particular aircraft had a problem. Since July 13th, 4 days before the crash, one of its two thrust reversers had been deactivated. The right engine's thrust reverser had jammed and could not be used. Now let me explain what a thrust reverser does. When an aircraft lands, it's traveling at around 140 to 160 knots. That's nearly 300 kilometers per hour. It needs to decelerate very quickly on a short runway. The aircraft uses three main systems to do this: wheel brakes, spoilers, and thrust reversers. Think of thrust reversers like putting a car in reverse while it's still moving forward. They redirect the force of the engines so that instead of pushing the plane forward, the engines are now pushing backward. TAM cleared the aircraft for flight under what's called the minimum equipment list. This is a standard industry practice. Airlines have a list of equipment that can be inoperative as long as certain conditions are met. A single inoperative thrust reverser falls within this list. At the controls of Flight 3054 were two of the most experienced pilots. Captain Henrique Stefanini Di Sacco was 53 years old with over 13,600 flight hours and more than 30 years of experience. In the right seat was Kleber Aguiar Lima, 54 years old with an even more impressive 14,760 hours. But here is something unusual. This flight had two captains, not a captain and a first officer. This was not a standard practice. The industry generally avoids it. It tends to create ambiguity about who is in command and who defers to whom. TAM had let this happen because the airline had grown so fast it had not properly balanced its ratio of senior to junior pilots. Both men knew this landing was going to be difficult. They had been flying since July 13th with the inoperative thrust reverser. They knew the runway at Congonhas had been giving pilots trouble for weeks. They knew the weather was bad. 5 minutes after departing Porto Alegre, they heard that Congonhas had shut down again due to poor braking conditions. The runway reopened. And at 1843, Flight 354 began its descent towards Sao Paulo through dense cloud and intermittent rain. It's 6:54 p.m., rush hour in Sao Paulo. TAM Flight 3054 is on final approach to runway 35 liters. The aircraft crosses the threshold at 142 knots. The touchdown point is normal. Everything appears routine. But 2 seconds before touchdown, the aircraft's computer issues a warning.
Retard.
A standard call-out on the Airbus A320, a reminder to bring the thrust levers back to idle. The wheels hit the runway. The left thrust lever is pulled back into reverse. The left engine responds, generating reverse thrust, pushing backward. The auto thrust disengages. The right engine, now running on its own, reads the lever position. It accelerates. For the spoilers to work, both the levers have to be idle, but in this case, the right lever is not. The spoilers do not deploy. The left engine is pushing backward. The right engine is pushing forward at full climb power. The wing brakes are flat against the wing, generating no drag because the lever condition is not met, and the runway is slick with rain and missing its drainage grooves. The aircraft is not decelerating. It is nearly maintaining speed. Captain DeSacco is the first to realize.
Slow down, we are going too fast. I can't, there's no response from the reverse thrust.
The words are chilling. They are hurtling toward the end of the runway at 90 knots. They have no meaningful deceleration. They have no spoilers. There is nowhere to go. Congonhas runway 35L sits on elevated ground. The drop at the end leads directly onto Avenida Washington Luiz, one of the busiest roads in Sao Paulo, packed with rush hour traffic. The aircraft becomes airborne again briefly as it clears the edge of the runway. The pilots, in their final seconds, attempt a go-around. But at that speed, there is nowhere for the plane to go. The aircraft clips the roof of a Shell petrol station. Then it hits the TAM Express cargo warehouse at full speed. The fireball is visible across the city. All 187 people on board die instantly. 12 people in the warehouse and surrounding area also lose their lives. It takes 26 seconds from the moment the wrong lever position is locked in to the moment the aircraft leaves the runway. The investigation that followed pointed at almost everyone. The pilots made the critical error of not setting both thrust levers to idle on touchdown. The investigation found this was caused by a misapplication of the modified procedure for the deactivated reverser, a procedure they had been flying with for 4 days but may not have been adequately trained on. But the investigation did not stop there. The Brazilian Aviation Authority should have closed Congonhas entirely that evening, given the rain and the known braking conditions on the runway. It did not. The airport authority had resurfaced the runway and opened it to traffic without the grooves that prevent hydroplaning. If those grooves had been there, even imperfect braking might have been enough. Airbus was criticized for not building a warning system that would alert pilots if the spoilers failed to deploy after touchdown. If the crew had received an immediate alarm the moment the spoilers stayed flat, they had perhaps 5 or 6 seconds to react before the runway ran out. A warning system could have given them that. And TAM was criticized for failing to properly train its pilots on the modified landing procedure for a deactivated reverser, and for the practice of pairing 2 captains in a single cockpit. Prosecutors eventually charged TAM's director of flight safety, the airline's vice president of operations, and the director of Brazil's Civil Aviation Authority, not the pilots who died in the crash. The changes that followed were sweeping. Grooves were cut into the Congonhas runways. An engineered materials arrestor system, essentially a deep bed of crushable concrete designed to catch an overrunning aircraft, was installed at the end of runway 35LS. Operational restrictions were introduced for wet conditions. Training requirements were overhauled. All of it came one disaster too late. 199 people never made it home that night, and a country's aviation system had to burn to the ground, literally before Brazil decided to fix what everyone already knew was broken.